Welcome to this Davenant podcast. I don't know the name of it yet, but I'm sure by release we'll figure that out. I'm joined by Michael Lynch, John Ehrett, and Steven Wedgeworth, and we're here to talk about the topic of retrieval. And part of why we wanted to do that was John wrote an article for us at Fontes magazine called The End of Protestant Retrieval. It was an interesting take on things. There was some, I would say, friendly disagreement, and we thought it'd be worth talking about here on a podcast. So before we kind of get into the disagreement part, I'd love to hear, John, just explain the article, like why you wrote it, and where maybe you see the disagreements about it so far. Like how would you locate those disagreements? And then we'll kind of move from there.
Sure thing. So, as Wyatt mentioned, the article is called "The End of Protestant Retrieval," and that title actually is a joke. It is a reference to teleology and the end or purpose for which we engage in retrieval. So, just from the outset, I think there were some people who just saw the title and were like, "Oh my goodness, Davenant Institute is saying we should not do retrieval anymore," and we're trying to gatekeep the project of retrieval from the lay people, and that's absolutely not the case. In fact, I think pretty much all of us here and pretty much every pastor in America would love it if their parishioners read more books. I think our country would vastly benefit. Our entire Western world would benefit from more people reading books, and especially from reading Christian books and Protestant books and the works of our forefathers. So very much in favor of all of that. And so what I really wanted to focus on in the article is what the purpose of retrieval is in a theological context and what some of the limitations of that practice are. So, just as some background, so I'm LCMS Lutheran. I've been LCMS Lutheran all my life. And one of the things that I think you sort of grow up in the LCMS being familiar with is the fact that Martin Luther wrote a lot, and that work is of varying quality. And so, as a Lutheran, it was never a real secret, I guess, for me that Martin Luther wrote stuff like On the Jews and Their Lies, which is a pretty anti Semitic tract that he wrote towards the end of his life, where he talks about crackdowns on the Jewish people, about seizing their books and burning their synagogues and so on. And he wrote some crazy and hyperbolic stuff in the Table Talks and some other texts as well, against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants. And the things that I think even Luther himself would at various points in his career describe as intemperate. And if you look at Luther's career as a whole, he actually does have significant variation in how he makes theological arguments over time and some of the positions that he takes. And so I guess as a Lutheran, it's never been in question that when we do theological retrieval of Luther's work, when we look at the things that Luther wrote, we sift. We consider what he wrote in what context and whether or not that is something that can ultimately be tested against the standards of Scripture for truth. And this is how I've always thought about how we as Protestants approach reading the works of our forefathers. We don't treat them like Scripture, we evaluate them according to the standards of Scripture. Well, lately, as the retrieval conversation has kind of expanded and moved into some new different trajectories in the last several years, one of the things that I've started to see online, in some forewords to books and various arguments, is something along the lines of the argument that if you really want to honor your Protestant fathers, then you should agree with them when they say XYZ thing about political or social context. So when they talk about, really aggressive crackdowns on religious liberty in the public square, honoring your Protestant forefathers means that you need to not just take that seriously and think through it from a Christian perspective, but basically see that as, in some sense, binding or normative for how we do our political life today and how we conceive of what a God-honoring polity would look like. So there's an extension here well beyond, I think, the first wave of the initial Protestant retrieval conversations. And once that became a little more ecumenical and really focused on doctrine of God issues and the recovery of classical theism, and we've seen a movement out of that space kind of in the last few years. Now, the form of this argument is something that I've simply never seen from the Davenant Institute, that you should be bound in some sense by things that your Protestant forefathers said simply because they were your Protestant forefathers. And in fact, in some cases, I've even seen people using the phrase the Protestant magisterium or the Reformed magisterium, unironically, as if there's a binding force that is comparable to how Roman Catholics think about the accumulated weight of tradition, in a sense that is a meaningful and authoritative adjunct or even a substitute for what Scripture actually provides. And so what the piece is doing is basically just kind of spelling that argument out, that not all retrieval is of the same sort, and that retrieving something about the doctrine of God, which is eternally valid, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything the reformers said about social or political issues in their particular context, given the material backdrop against which they were working, that doesn't mean this is translatable for us necessarily into contemporary conditions, at least without significant qualifications and nuancing. And so I would say that social and political retrieval does need to be contextualized, accounting for the changes in history that have elapsed since then. That's not saying in any sense don't retrieve or don't retrieve social and political doctrines and don't think through these in a Christian way. It's simply saying that as Protestants, you need to justify the truth of those claims by reference to Scripture, by references to authority that go beyond just appealing to authority as such, as the kind of the lodestar for this. And then finally, what I draw out is that even if when we talk about kind of their theories of Christendom or whatever, even if that's not directly applicable to our current cultural context in many ways, because the conditions that would allow for what they're calling for have in many ways passed away, then simply the act of thinking about this in Christian terms and in Christian categories, thinking about what it means to order all aspects of our life to God, this is a useful and devotional practice and useful way of thinking as Christians about complicated issues that goes well beyond just, looking at this as a blueprint for what we could do at some imagined future date if the political conditions were ripe for kind of a resurgence of early modernity.
Mhm.
And that really was the shape of the argument that I was articulating in that piece. And I think, as I mentioned, there were some folks who responded to that by saying, this is gatekeeping and trying to shut people down from doing kind of social and political retrieval. And that, again, that was definitely not the purpose in any way. And one other thing that I think if I was writing the piece again, I would clarify this more. I make a reference in that piece to the fact that in many ways, when people are trying to apply principles they derive from the early modern Protestant context to modern conditions, there's an over-reliance or over-invocation of prudence. And as anybody who's read the classical tradition of politics will recognize, prudence is frequently invoked as a virtue that statesmen need to exercise in the service of their vocation. My concern with this is that appealing to prudence allows the level of political concepts to be set at such a high level of generality that when you're talking about sourcing the Protestant tradition as a solution to our present day ills, you see arguments of the form, the political tradition and the nature of politics means that we pursue the common good, and the common good means that we can exercise the law and exercise power for the good as we determine it for the people. And then you ask people what that means in particular contexts like immigration law, like religious liberty again, and you hear kind of vague abstract appeals to prudence, where it's very clear that there is some solution to current problems being envisioned, but that's not ever spelled out. So the actual policy commitments in question, which we could talk about in a substantive way, those are ultimately left completely opaque. And you have people saying, I appeal to the Protestant tradition, the common good supports this, this is exercise of power for the common good. That may be very well and good, but if you really want to address this to our present conditions, you need to be a little bit more specific about what you mean by exercising prudence. And so spelling out the exercise of prudence in clearer ways is something I think is necessary to make retrieval really meaningful in this context.
Yeah, I think that last point too makes a lot of sense in my experience, where sometimes you can say this is a prudential decision, but that carries a lot of weight. You still need to re-argue. And it maybe, and this might be not the way that you would put it. As I hear you, one thing I could say is there's a difference between repristinating the past, like just kind of repeating it. And then there's also maybe this idea of using the past wisdom and contextualizing it for today. That might be two ways to put it in a more, I don't know, straightforward level, but maybe you wouldn't want it quite that straightforward. I
I,
think that
I,
makes.
I like
Go
that a
on, sorry.
lot. And I was just going to say, here's a real world example of this being a particular issue. And so I think the Protestant tradition and basically the whole classical tradition of European law has a lot of interesting things to say about property rights and how we conceive of property, especially as it's ordered to God as the universal destination of goods. Now, my day job does involve working on policy issues, and not that long ago, I was asked to consider kind of what a first principles way of thinking about intellectual property would look like. And so that for me is obviously going to be what is a Christian way of thinking about intellectual property issues? And this is simply not a question that I could easily go to one of the reformers and get an answer for because the concept of intellectual property does not even really become on anybody's radar until maybe the 1700s at best, at least the 1800s. And so this idea simply post dates the time when many of these people were writing about this. And so if I, as somebody who does do work in policy, is looking to retrieve the insights of my forerunners for this, then what's going to be required is some knowledge of how to take principles from the past and really carry them forward into modern conditions and basically contextualize what a traditional doctrine of property and God, our relationship to God and property looks like when the nature of property is really different in terms of not being excludable in the same way that property was when it was all real property or chattels and transportable property. And so that's the kind of conversation about how we exercise prudence in the act of retrieval and apply that to contemporary conditions. That's the kind of retrieval I think would be incredibly useful. And that's not the way that I think we've seen some of these doctrines and ideas that have come from the reformers about social conditions being invoked. At least, and maybe I'm caricaturing here, but at least a lot of what people seem to be looking for in the reformers is ammunition to be used to support doctrines of, quote, the natural affections, and really have a certain kind of anti-universalist, highly particularist understanding of human social relations, and find argumentative support for that position, as opposed to kind of looking at the actual challenges we face and seeing how
Hmm.
to exercise Protestant principles and how to draw on multiple different strands of that tradition to address real contemporary problems.
Yeah, it's an interesting last point. We use this universal platform called like the internet to argue for particularist arguments. Stephen, I know that I think you had maybe some modest disagreements with parts of the article. I find it interesting that we have, I think, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, and an Anglican on here. I didn't actually think about that beforehand. I wonder if there's a difference also from ecclesial and confessional background for how you
Sure. Yeah. When
receive,
I
the
I first
Reformation
saw
past. So maybe
the
Stephen,
title, I was
can you
triggered.
just kind of provide some context for the areas that you
I,
thought were successful, maybe some of the
I
areas
said,
that
I'm
you
going to
had
have to read
questions
this
about?
thing. Okay. It reminded me of the Peter Leithart piece, The End of Protestantism, which
Yeah.
was actually instrumental in launching the Davenant Institute. We put on a symposium where we talked about that, and we're largely opposed to that thesis. And he was doing that same double play, but he was a little bit more emphasizing, it's coming to an end, it's going away, we're past it. So I was definitely hoping that was not going to be the case with this essay, and it was not. But the title did catch that eye. There were some things that I definitely agree with. The argument that the Protestant tradition is not a magisterium. And I make this point in the introduction to the Protestant social teaching book. Even though we're using this confident language about Protestant social teaching, there is no singular Protestant institution. We don't even think that the visible corporations that we call churches or denominations are necessarily, the authoritative interpreters of the natural law. We think that resides in any rational individual. So I agree with all of that. And the use of tradition for Protestants, it really is as consensual exegesis, corporate and collective rational argument over the years, and then putting that together and building something that really is demonstrably true. That's the benefit of it. But it is important to have because, we forget this stuff. And it's so easy to be taken advantage by the latest trend. When I first became Reformed, every Reformed person I met was basically a libertarian. If they weren't a full-blown libertarian, they were pretty close. And so I start reading Calvin and then the Westminster Puritans, and they are not. They're not libertarian. Even in the American divines, they're not that way. And so that was kind of a wake-up call. Like, okay, maybe I need to rethink some of this stuff. It was helpful there. So even though it's not a magisterium, it is very important. It's a guide, and that's a big part of what Davenant Institute's all about, is bringing that guide back to the public eye. But some concerns I had are some criticisms. On my first reading, there was at least one line. It seemed to say, we want to treat the tradition's reading of theology, things that are proper to biblical exegesis and systematics and dogmatics. We want to give that a premium. We want to defer to that. But then the traditions sort of take on social and political views. Probably that's not so helpful anymore. And there was a line in there where John said, he's going to lay his cards on the table. He's not, I forget how he put it, not optimistic, or doesn't see as much value in political ressourcement. And then also made the analogy to sort of a geocentrism. Apparently, the Lutherans have a crisis on their hands in some departments. So the idea is, of course, we wouldn't credit any of this geocentrism stuff. And so, likewise, we shouldn't be as interested in their social and political views. That was at least a superficial take there. Maybe is not as charitable as it should have been. And I did want to object there because, as I recall, the argument was that their treatment of theology is abstract. It's more universal. It's more timeless, whereas the politics is all contextual and bound up. And I think we want to be careful with that. There are some political arguments that are highly, highly contextual and absolutely are going to be very perilous to just cut and paste. But there are still basic political principles. Whether or not the magistrate should be interested in the spiritual destiny of the people under their care. That's a basic philosophical question. Answer yes or no, and you can get into how to do it, right? But in and of itself, that question is every bit as abstract theory as anything else. And similarly, in systematic theology or biblical exegesis, you could get highly contextualized. You can say, hey, Calvin and Luther, they didn't have access to Michael Heiser. They didn't know all the treasure troves that are out there in ancient Near Eastern studies, so we can get beyond them now. And I don't like it when people do that. We want to be careful. We want to make sure we're using the best tools we have. We're up to date, but not so fast. Let's don't just jump onto a quick bandwagon and dismiss people as not having all the tools. So that would be one of my objections.
I want to hear from Michael Lynch as well. John, do you feel like you want to just respond to anything you said quickly, or do you want to let Michael Lynch say something and respond to both afterwards? Either or seems fine to me.
Michael can go.
Okay, we'll let Michael go, and then so I could see you nodding, Michael. I assumed you agreed with what Steven said there. So do you want to clarify or add to what was said?
Yeah, this is that was one of my largest criticisms of the essay, was that even the early moderns recognized the difference between prudential application of their political principles and those things that they claim to be timeless. And if you listen to Stephen Wolfe, whom I've actually listened a ton to him, not just the book, but listen to him talk about these things, he does not. You seem to read into motives that he may or may not have, but the simple matter of it is that you cannot move to application or these prudential applications unless you agree on the principles. And he's convinced that people aren't even agreed on the principles that he thinks that the early modern Reformed, and not just the early modern Reformed, and this is my other criticism, is that these guys don't see the early modern Reformed as being insulated from the broader medieval and kind of patristic tradition on all of this. And so it's really, you say at one point, it isn't, you talk about simply because they were the Reformers' claims. No, Wolfe wouldn't say that. Wolfe would say, because they were the Reformers' claims, and those claims were held to be both jus gentium and natural law. In other words, these are principles that everyone should always hold to. So, for example, you talk about the common good, right? So the basic syllogism would be the magistrate has a duty to promote the common good of his nation. Minor premise: the common good, or an essential aspect of the common good of any nation is its religion. Ergo, it follows that the magistrate should have care over religion in his thing. Now, that's an argument, that's a jus gentium argument, and also, right, every nation understood this. It would seem to be natural law. It would seem to be biblical. per Romans 13 and so on and so forth. Anyways, when he says, I don't want to talk about the prudential questions, he's saying, in some sense, I'm not even qualified to, I don't know all the information that would be necessary to even make, claims on how to deal with immigration law. But let's just agree on these principles first. And if we don't agree on the principles, why would we talk about prudential questions? The prudential questions flow from the principles. If you don't agree with the principles, how can you even have a conversation? There's no common ground. And so that was one of my concerns. Also, the social thing, right? Like, you cite Garris. I should note that Garris and Wolf I know personally. Garris I went to school with at RTS. Steven was right before us. He may have overlapped a little bit with Garris, but I was there pretty much the whole time with Garris at Reformed Theological Seminary, so I know him very well. And Steven I know fairly well as well. And you quote at one point Garris saying something about, you say, the historic Reformed teaching on male rule in the home. And again, that would be a principle. That would be something that the Reformers would have seen as jus gentium and natural law and taught in the Bible. But the application of it is always prudential, right? So hence the stupid question about 5, if the husband asks, this is a Twitter question that was on yesterday that was raging about whether or not if a husband asks his wife to wear a red dress every single day, is she, has to do it. Well, do we agree that males ought to rule in their house? That's the principal question. And then that's more of a prudential, weird question of whether or not that's a right thing to do and whether or not she should obey that sort of command and all these sorts of things. All that to say is that was Stephen's concern gets at least one of my main concerns with the piece.
All right. Well, I would say the level of intensity is interesting. It moved up depending on the tradition, but it kind of makes sense with stereotypes. Anglicans, Presbyterians, I would say that it fits. I think this is helpful. So I try to write down all what I could see, but I mean, the idea there's no Protestant magisterium is correct. Wedgeworth brought out, but we should, we defer to theology, but there's also some major first principles of politics that, of course, we would all agree on. I think that was agreed by Michael Lynch. Michael Lynch also says some of the opponents I think that you were pointing to already distinguish between unchanging and changing principles. So there's already that there, and so maybe you overplayed your criticism. And then the final point on jus gentium and natural law and all that kind of stuff that was just articulated. So I think those are kind of some big picture disagreements. So John, I would want to give you opportunity just to kind of like process, talk through those. How do you receive them? Do you think some of them were fair blows, or do you think maybe slightly overstated against you? How would you respond to those criticisms?
Sure. So, I think I would say this is something that I think really it emerges in Michael's points, but Stephen sort of gets at this too. One of the things that this piece, the target of this piece, I would say, is at least in some sense the idea that the ultimate end game of retrieval, as we do it, is providing a roadmap to address current contemporary political ills and provide essentially some form of direct applicability to that. And when the piece came out, a friend of mine who I do like, he mentioned that I think he said, well, I thought the point of all this was that it was to rebuild Christian civilization. And so the goal here, the idea here basically is that, we have cultural chaos that we see all around us, and that retrieval in some sense provides a bulwark against this and a blueprint for building something alternatively. So that basically sets up an antagonism between the contemporary milieu in which we find ourselves and what retrieval entails of us. So implicitly, there is a conflict between, on the one hand, what we have now and what we can sort of conceive a prudential application of some sort of the Protestant tradition's principle ultimately would be. What that makes me want to ask is, what is that prudential application? Are we actually just saying, we're going to apply forward all of the things that the reformers did, and that is the antithesis against which we're understanding modern culture? And I think that move is made subconsciously. The idea that we might possibly have reached the current understanding of politics that we have on the basis of Protestant principles, idea, and I would contest that in various ways, but that possibility simply isn't admitted. There is an implicit assumption that the Protestant tradition provides a meaningful antithesis to the form of the current world, and that makes me want to ask, if we take these principles, then clearly there is some idea of a prudential application of these that is adverse to the status quo, and that's what I'm trying to get at. What does that actually look like? I think in many ways, when people use make these kinds of arguments, they're referring back to basically the conditions on the ground that people did argue for at that point. And so I want to focus on something that Michael mentioned briefly, that we need to agree on principles before moving to application. And in one sense, I couldn't agree more, because I do think that if you're having incommensurable discussions, then you can't move forward in any meaningful sense. But my response to that would be, I think in many ways, more people in these conversations agree than they think they disagree on a exoteric level, but they do agree on an esoteric level, we could say. So let's take the example of religious liberty. So it is seen as a conflict of principles that religious liberty is absolute, religious liberty can't be absolute. I don't really believe that there are people that believe that religious liberty should be absolute in any meaningful sense. Everybody acknowledges that the Aztecs should not be performing human sacrifices, and that is not a valid restriction. That is not a valid exercise of religious liberty. And so, if the civil magistrate says, no human sacrifices, prohibits that practice, people accept that. And then the question then is, we're arguing about prudence, and we're arguing about how far religious liberty can go given various other principles, and whether or not the magistrate has a responsibility for spiritual care. I think if you work this out, that spiritual practice, that is human sacrifice, that and prohibiting that practice, that is something that serves the common good. And so I think there is more agreement on a level of principles, and we are disagreeing in a sense about prudential applications of those things. So I think, to sum all that up, I think the argument that we have to establish principles before prudence, that I think is a distraction from the fact that the driving question behind a lot of this retrieval discourse is, how do we rely on the Protestant tradition to offer a meaningful response to our contemporary social ills? I think we can talk in subsequent sections about whether that is the best way to be thinking about retrieval in general. But I think many people who do come to this conversation from this perspective do have that idea that retrieval is in some sense leading us to a place that is different from where we are now, or can do that. And that's why I think getting specific about what those prudential applications look like really is important, especially when there is agreement on what a lot of those principles do actually look like, even if people don't necessarily recognize that they do in fact agree. I really agree with some of the points that Steven mentioned, that people can make arguments that our theological reasoning does this change with things like Michael Heiser, and that is contextualized too, and such that there is an ongoing conversation. And I again, that traditions develop, and we have ongoing arguments about basically the implications of theological claims that are worked out through Protestant history, and I think that is also really important. I would just say that the way I think I frame this in the piece is that this does not go to, I would never make the argument that just take the theological claims which are true and dump everything else. But I would say, given the range of pressures that tend to inform how individuals formulate social and political claims, especially in the context of the Reformation, where there are serious questions of huius religio, ejus religio, that are going on, and whether or not individuals can have a kind of sovereignty that's independent of the authority of the papacy. And folks like Luther and Calvin are operating in that milieu. I think it is reasonable to ask whether, just as a general principle, that some of the political and social teachings that emerge in that context are more likely to be affected by these kinds of contingent circumstances than the theological positions they were advancing. Not going to say, I would not make that claim in absolute terms, but this is a claim about probabilities and what is more likely to be impacted in that context, and how that does, whether or not that bears on our receipt of those and our way of thinking about the application of those down through the centuries. And so I think I argue that multiple points. Just because this claim is a social and political claim of the Reformers doesn't mean it's not necessarily true. I think you need to make a separate argument for that, as opposed to just kind of making a blind appeal to authority, or just saying this is something that the Reformers thought, ergo it's binding as a kind of Protestant magisterium. So all that to say that Stephen's point, I think, is really well taken, and I appreciate both him and Michael's points.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the material conditions of when all these things come about, it seems important. You have to have a target for what you're doing. I do feel that a lot of people that do retrieval, I mean, it depends on the circle that you're in, but there's often different ideological reasons for why you're retrieving. It's not in my opinion, always a neutral. I just want to find first principles. For me, I mean, like I'm very like church centered in my thinking. So when I think of retrieval, I think of confessional retrieval within a confessional bounds to promote agreed upon doctrine, to give depth to it. So I think more of liturgy, Christology, Trinity. I do think, though, increasingly there is a sense in which people are hungrier for kind of a more robust political theology and retrieval. Stephen, going back to you, like, how do you've kind of heard maybe Michael Lynch's criticisms, kind of John's responses. It seems like he took what you said pretty charitably and is kind of understanding that. Is there anything that you'd like to add more to, like what do you, when you think of retrieval, what are you hoping to accomplish? How would you contrast John's vision and even some of the ways maybe Michael
like how I'm different from
articulated as
John
well?
and
I'll give
Michael because I
Michael a
don't
chance
know
to
enough
answer the same question. Like,
of what
is
they
your
would
kind of
say. I don't want to,
positive vision of
presume on
retrieval
that.
then?
But for me, there's a couple of things to say about it. One, again, it's sort of autobiography. Retrieval has been super helpful for me as an alternative to what had seemed to be my options when I was younger, which was sort of like a Christian Reconstruction theonomy, where you just, go look for the Old Testament verse, and then that's your answer. Or the sort of like secularized two kingdoms argument that you see associated with Westminster, California, where they just say, well, Christianity just doesn't do this stuff. That was all a mistake. We need to focus on spiritual matters, and everything else is just kind of normal, earthly, secular politics, but it's not ever going to be religious in that sense. And I was initially, I definitely didn't like the secular kind of argument, so I was attracted to the Reconstructionist because, hey, that's a project, like the Big Lebowski says, right? At least it's an ethos. But then retrieval was like, oh, wow, there's actually this really exciting world of many different thinkers, lots of different kinds of arguments, and precisely because it is a little bit weird, it's like C.S. Lewis says, reading old books, because it is so foreign, then you're not immediately like fighting it. Oh, I don't like this. I don't like that. It's so weird. You can actually just say, well, hey, let's just think about the ideas here. So I found it to be a really promising avenue to return to different styles of argument, different options that have been forgotten, to still have a religious Christian inflection to it, and also to have a little bit of distance so that it isn't captive to the precise political controversy of the day, but is a little bit more of a universal thing. That's what I like about it. So I'm probably going to agree with John when he says he's suspicious of people that think it's an immediate fix to a political issue today. I really find it irritating, frustrating when people say, oh, this is a right-wing project, because it's an anachronism. There was no right wing or left wing in the 16th century, in the 17th century. And some of these thinkers that people want to code as right wing would have actually been more of a proto-liberal if you took them on their own terms. Althusius, for example, he says that the authorities in government receive their legitimacy from the consent of the people. Well, goodness, that's, you're 2/3 of the way to Thomas Jefferson, right? I'll tell you, Bishop John Overall in England rejects that argument explicitly in his Convocation book. He says, if anyone says the sovereign receives his jurisdiction from the consent of the governed, he's in great error. So that's a real difference right there. And Althusius also says women can be magistrates. So you have to treat this stuff within its own context, and not just jump to saying like, oh, by today's standards, this strikes me as really far out on this direction or that direction. I would rather treat it as like, no, it is a little bit foreign. And so that means we need to understand it on its own terms, and then we can do the hard work of taking what would be applicable to today, on a level of principle and on a level of rational and practical application.
That's incredibly helpful. And I'm not sure I'm actually disagreeing with John here, but I'm using the word prudence.
Yeah.
I do think there's an aspect of wisdom and prudence, though, that does require you
Yeah.
to slow
Now, there's no
down.
doubt. There's
and
no
it does
doubt
require
that
you to
no doubt that we say
pause,
prudence
reflect, and that's maybe
when
a
we
little bit
don't
what you're
want
getting
to
at,
fill
Stephen,
in
when
the
you're talking
blank,
about
right? Let's
how
be
you
honest
read something
about
like
that,
Althusius
right?
today.
We're
in their
running
own
out of
context.
time. We don't want to put
Like, I saw
all our cards
you,
on the
I think,
table. So we say
nodding.
prudence. Okay, granted, that's a problem, but yeah, like the
Right.
flexibility and the okay, this one idea might apply in 2 to 3 different ways. I think that's just absolutely essential to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Michael, I saw you simultaneously nodding and then leaning in to add something. So, did you want to add context to what Stephen was saying, or maybe advance your own?
No, I just agree with overall,
Okay.
but I do have other comments.
Well, I would like to hear kind of. So I think I heard Stephen. You kind of heard my point of view. I'm a little bit more narrow in my vision of retrieval, I'm sure, than others would be. Just because mostly just based on interest, not because I have a big philosophical reason behind it. But I think more of I'm retrieving some within my confessional bounds in order to help me deepen my worship for the church. That's kind of how I'm wired and got into it. But I do agree that there's more to the story than my personal interest. I like what Stephen was saying, but I'd like to hear, Michael. You can kind of bring out your notes, but I would like to kind of hear how you think of maybe a positive vision of what a positive vision of retrieval is as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it was mentioned earlier about distractions, and I actually think talking about method of retrieval is distraction itself,
Mm-hmm.
because it seems to me that we intuitively and naturally retrieve that which we deem to be either good, true, or helpful, and we don't retrieve that which we don't deem to be good, true, or helpful. So if I think that in the classroom, it's helpful for us to read, I'm forgetting his name. I had his name on my lips. 19th century guy on free speech. Most famous. Free speech. 19th century. It was wild. Reading no, not Paine. 19th century. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Regardless, I hate his stuff, but he's like the main guy on free speech. Okay, right? Like I think he's despicable. His writings are despicable, but I would retrieve that for the classroom. John Stuart Mill. Yeah,
I just used Grok, and it came up with John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, exactly, Mill. Right? So Mill, I hate Mill. I hate reading Mill. He drives me nuts. However, I retrieve him in the classroom because he's helpful, i.e. helpful for precisely the reasons that Ehrett said at the end. He's a good dialogue partner. He gets you thinking. You can ask yourself, why do you hate it so much, or why do you like it so much, and blah, 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 blah. It's helpful. It's not good. It's not true. It's horrible. Okay? But we retrieve it for that reason. We retrieve things sometimes because we find them helpful, just as conversation partners. But then sometimes we retrieve things that we think are good or true, and we do that as well. And I think a lot of this is just some people don't like some of the things that people are retrieving because they don't think it's good or true, and other people think it's good and true, and so they want to retrieve it. And that's just a simple matter of it. And I think that most everything else doesn't even matter. Like, the argument is really about value judgments on whether or not we think this is good or bad, whether or not we think this is true or false, or whether or not we think this is helpful or unhelpful. And I think that that's where this whole debate actually ought to be. But anyway, so that was my whole thing. And I'm for retrieving those things that are good, true, or helpful for various situations, contextually, prudentially speaking.
Well, I think that's fair. Like in a classroom setting, if we're talking about the history of free speech, I think, at least as I saw people talking, or at least as I kind of process it, I'm thinking more of a Christian who's retrieving for the sake of the church, for spirituality and so on, and to learn how to be a good Christian and a good citizen, for example. So then my context is more, the kinds of things that maybe Davenant is typically publishing. But I kind of understand what you're saying. I mean, I just finished my semester teaching an intro to faith and philosophy. So I taught a whole class on Friedrich Nietzsche. It's not because I necessarily agree with him, but he's a great conversation partner to illustrate some of the things that we're kind of going through. Okay, so John, I want you to have an opportunity to give a little bit more of a positive view of what I know you've already kind of done, kind of restate it, and maybe and maybe see if there's a bit more rapprochement between these two opinions than meets the eye. And if there isn't, I guess that's fine too.
No, this has been incredibly fruitful because I think what this has revealed for me is that there are at least three different in this conversation, at least three different positions from which one undertakes retrieval. And so you have Michael talking about in the classroom setting. You've got you, Wyatt, and Steven talking about how to do this in a church setting. And at least me and my vocation, like retrieval for me actually did result in me changing my policy commitments and that being the frame through which I interpret these conversations. And so let me give background on what I mean by that. And so originally, as I think somebody mentioned, I used to be a libertarian too, and so I was a pretty dogmatic libertarian. I was even a Koch intern when I was in college, and ultimately, once I got into retrieval through once I read, I might have been Ed Phaser or something, but I realized that my entire doctrine of God was basically a univocal account of being, and I had been totally out of sync with the entire Christian tradition as historically understood up to that point. And so, if you get that wrong, there's a huge amount of stuff in the Western tradition, the philosophy and metaphysics, just unintelligible. So when you talk about natural law, it doesn't make any sense if you're just thinking about God ordering things to do something in like a voluntaristic sense. And so once you have your metaphysics squared away, all of this is just more intelligible. And so that's originally how I got into retrieval conversations. But you can't make that shift without starting to think about the relation of all things directly in a meaningful sense to God and how that affects your understanding of property rights. And I would say it's very hard to have a libertarian account of property rights and embrace traditional theological categories and the account of the dependence on all things on God. And so carrying through those retrieval commitments unsettled my economic beliefs. And that ultimately led me to leave the law firm where I worked and to go into public service, advancing policies that I thought were more consistent with what I viewed to be a Christian understanding of economic policy. And, this is stuff you get in Luther as well. So even if you don't accept necessarily that a community chest is the best means of social welfare provision, Luther has an awful lot to say about usury and about the responsibility of public authority to take action against this and to punish sins like monopolists setting themselves up as tyrants, spitting in the face of God in that sense. And so all of that to say, for me at least, in my position and my vocation, retrieval led to translation into political efforts to affect the world. But I think what this conversation's really brought forward for me is that retrieval really functions differently in different vocational contexts. And that might be a distinction that I think is worth drawing out further, because what that means pastorally, academically, we use one word to describe three different categories. And I think shifting between those different registers might be generating some of the heat on social media.
Yeah, it might be. It might be just the use of that word for different vocations. Maybe they're hearing you speak in one register and they're thinking of another. I think that's a helpful way to get at it. I mean, in many ways, all of us here to a degree have done retrieval. Like you talked about, going through usury and talking about intellectual property right and all that kind of stuff. I think it's kind of funny with the Reformation. You read Calvin, you think about how he worked with deacons and feeding the poor. Then I've actually thought about that, how that translates to a local church. And in many ways, it's not really an easy one-to-one transfer when you think of how Geneva, the city, did it. So there's even another interesting overlap where you have like the Genevan city church type thing and how that applies to a congregational church today, for example. Well, maybe like we have just a little bit of time left. It could be useful to talk about some of the published works that we've done in retrieving, or some of you have done, and talk about why you've done it and how that's been helpful. I don't know if that's a great way to end. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know, Stephen, you actually brought up earlier the book on Protestant social teaching, and I wanted to bring that up because you said you made a comment in that book. We don't have a magisterium as Protestants, but there is sort of common law or natural law, common law, these kind of like accrued ways of thinking and reasoning. Maybe you could just briefly summarize why you were instrumental in getting that book published, because it's a very different topic than, say, Lynch's book on John Davenant.
So,
and Death of
years
Christ, for example.
ago,
It's very
when
different
the
ends,
Davenant Institute
very
was
different
being
from John's
formed,
article as well online.
we would say
Maybe
we
just
wanted to
summarize a
make
little bit of that, 'cause I
sure
thought
that
that was
we
an
were in
interesting point that you
communication
brought up.
with the church and the academy, but also educated and engaged lay people. And we particularly had, kind of lawyers and political activists and community service people in mind. We wanted folks who are interested in applying Christianity to their vocation. And I really was worried that we had not done justice to that third category. Some of that's because most of our personnel are pastors and teachers, and it's just easier, right, to republish Richard Baxter's pastoral devotional works or something like that. So I wanted to get something out there that did justice to that vocational sort of social aspect of retrieval. So, this very topic here, I wanted to do that. I also wanted to show that Protestants had a body of literature on this stuff, and it wasn't only the property of the Catholics to have kind of religious social teaching. And so it was a little bit of apologetic value, a little bit of recovering a part of our founding vision that I thought wasn't getting as much attention. And then also I just thought people would like it. It would be practical, it'd be interesting, something you could hand out to a wider audience.
Well, what I find interesting in this conversation is John was just talking about how there's different goals in terms of retrieving. This is interesting. It was a vocational goal. It was an apologetic goal, and even a polemical one in a sense. It's not just the Roman Catholics doing it, but also Protestants have it. I think that's a bit illuminating in this conversation as well. Now, Michael, you, for example, wrote you translated and edited a highly theological work. I can't remember the title, The Death of Christ. Can you remind me the title of the John Davenant book again?
Yeah, maybe John Davenant and the Death of Christ or something like that. But or On the Death of Christ. On the Death of Christ. Yeah, I mean, but this is the thing is that there's some people that don't like us retrieving that, and I understand why, and their reason is valid. They think it's wrong. I don't have.
But why do they think it's wrong? I guess that's what I'm getting at, because I think, at least I would say, that's part of a standard, the view in that book is part of a sort of confessional trajectory that we're part of.
Well, I mean, I agree.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Obviously, I agree. But the political and social things, it seems to me, there's those same sorts of trajectories, right? This gets Ehrett's article too. In some ways, is that there is a different read on history, as he noted, right? Some people see that some of these political principles that were seen to be obvious and true, and everyone agreed with it, use Gentium, all this sort of thing, were kind of eroded over time. And some people think we moved away from some of those to better ones or more, agreeable things. I mean, you see this, you don't even have to speculate on the way that people read history, even in the 19th century, about this. Just go read, I think it's Stuart Robinson makes this argument in his work on the Church of Christ, or on ecclesiastical power and church and state power or something like that, where he basically says, basically Constantine ruined it. The medievals, the early moderns, they all were terrible on political theology. But in the 19th century, we've kind of, in America, he's a Southern theologian, we've kind of found the kind of pinnacle of Southern Presbyterian spirituality of the church stuff, right? Like they do this stuff. That's the way they do it. So what is he retrieving? He's not retrieving the Old Testament, because the Old Testament doesn't help him. He's not retrieving Constantine or anything in between Constantine and the founding of America. He's basically New Testament. Right? Because that's the only place he can really go. And so he retrieves New Testament, right? Everyone retrieves that which they think is on their side, right? And this is just the way, I just think retrieval works that way naturally.
Well, I agree. The slight pushback I have, though, is I think if you're a confessional Christian, part of a Protestant tradition, I do think there is a realm of things that you ought to retrieve for positive religiosity, I think it's actually an important distinction.
Yeah, but
I know
if you think it's wrong, I mean, that's the simple matter of it. He thinks that Geneva was terrible. He thinks that the political relationship between the state and the church was terrible. So why would he retrieve that? He loves the theology. He loves the doctrine of God stuff, but he thought that was, to use Ehrett's phrase, very contextualized and largely unhelpful. I mean, that's what he says. So I don't understand why that's a problem. I will reject whatever I need to reject if I don't think it's true, or good, or beautiful, whether it's in my tradition or not. But
I don't think you mean it this way, but the way that you're expressing yourself sounds very subjective. I push back is you keep saying I, but no, we have confessional standards. We want it, the good, true, and the beautiful is what's been agreed upon in the history of the Catholic
Well,
Church.
yeah, of course. Of course.
I don't mean to say that you're saying that. It sounds to me very subjective what you're saying.
I just think everyone treats truth that way.
I agree with that. But I guess I'm talking about the positive vision at this point.
Well, the positive vision is that you give respect and you listen carefully, particularly to those in your tradition that that have been deemed your forefathers in the faith and these sorts of things, right? So, because I'm a Protestant, I listen to Calvin more carefully than Bellarmine. But I might agree with Bellarmine over Calvin on any particular exegesis.
Right, on the particular, yeah, I get that. I guess I'm saying for my church, I wouldn't retrieve Socinius for the doctrine of salvation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's kind of obvious.
Yeah, because I
might say he's a good conversation partner for why we disagree, but I do think there's like we're all agreeing that there's different parameters, there's different value judgments, but I don't think it's. I guess when I hear you say value, I go back to more of a Nietzsche kind of paradigm. Maybe that's wrong to do so. That's a bit more subjective, individualistic. I do think, for churchmen, we do have to be careful on how we're retrieving, what we're retrieving. Now, in the classroom setting, I agree with you. If you're talking about free speech, it's John Stuart Mill and all that kind of stuff. I might have just misheard you, but to me, I just heard you very individualistically.
I'm for retrieving Baxter, who's definitely in our tradition,
yeah.
on all things related to political theology. So let's do it. I agree.
I like it. That's a great way to finish. We're at 9:30. John, you were in the hot seat. Did you want to, because you were in the hot seat, I want to give you the final say if you have anything that you felt like was unclear or that you want to end with, because you had the most disagreements lodged at you.
No, I think this is great. I think the points where we disagree, I think we've worked out at least where those points are in many ways, and I think this has been a great conversation. Yeah, and I really appreciate everybody taking the time to go through this. And again, I hope the message, I think everybody here agrees, is that nobody has any intention of taking books away from people or saying don't read the original sources for yourselves, or that the Retrieval Project is somehow something that people are trying to gatekeep, because that's not the case at all. I think all of us are talking about the ways in which we engage the past in ways that are consistent with our Christian faith.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Michael.
All right,
thanks,
Wyatt.
Stephen. I think that was as far as we'll get in this conversation, but I think we've identified some of the key disagreements, and I'm really thankful for all of you to be able to share that and to converse with me today. So thank you.